right, so we're going to talk about nerves and anxiety a little bit, and not succumbing to them. Okay, so I won't go crazy long here because at 7:15 my time, I'm going on my other Facebook Live. If you want to join, so if you head over to athletespecific.com and you search for anxiety, you just do the word anxiety in the search bar, you'll see a video I did a while ago. But because it's the Olympics and the whole Simone Biles thing is going on and the Naomi Osaka thing goes going on, I thought I would talk a little bit about that from like an elite standpoint. I covered this last week on my podcast over there about because all of my elite coaching friends who work with elite coaches basically called BS on the whole Simone Biles thing and called BS on the Naomi Osaka thing. And a lot of people don't like that, but I'm just here to tell you athletically, the scoreboard does not care what is going on in your head. It doesn't care what's going on in your home. It doesn't care what social justice causes you want to pick up and fight for. At the end of the day, sport requires results. And what's funny is people like lashed out at people who are critical of the whole thing and the whole mental health conversation. But the harshest person or the harshest thing to judge an athlete is the clock at the finish line, right? It's the judge in the booth judging the score. That is harsher than any comment that anybody can give you or your athlete. Okay. And when people want to get wrapped up in the story behind an athlete and they go like, oh, well, but she should get a pass or he should get a pass or whatever, the sport doesn't give a pass. Okay. And so one of the things that I just wanted to kind of nip in the bud this weekend was this conversation about how like what really has come out of all this is that when your athlete doesn't feel great, right? And that is subjective for everybody. Okay. There's people who can public speak and there's people who can barely, like we know that people would rather be in the casket than give the eulogy at a funeral. Just gives you an idea in terms of like what's possible and what makes people feel nervous, right? And I love that example because public speaking is always a big one. But so for your goalie, a topic that came up last night with one of my goalie audits was this idea of a goalie who is rather quiet. I wouldn't call the goalie shy by any means, but and their parents might call him shy, but the idea is that the goalie is maybe a little reserved. But what's interesting to me is that goalies who come out, goalies who play this game, and just like the questions that were at the beginning of this from, I think it was Alex, David Ammenhauser, great. Is there a slang term for goalie yips, twisties, etc.? Yeah, I think so. I think for a lot of goalies, for me, I would get nervous hands. Like I would get tingly hands. And David, I appreciate you asking that question because one of the things I want your athletes to understand and the parents to understand is that elite athletic performance is not about performing in this like blissed out state with no nerves. Elite performance is performing at an elite level despite those feelings, right? So the idea is learning how to compete with the butterflies. And so for those of you guys that are kind of my generation, right, we used to call butterflies, and butterflies turned into like anxiety, and anxiety now has turned into like mental health. And any conversation around mental health gets people all uptight, like, oh my god, if somebody pulls the mental health card, you can't touch it. It's like and I disagree. I disagree because elite sport is all about performing, not quitting, not stepping away. It's about leaning into it because why? Some other athlete will. And I want that to be your athlete. I want that to be your goalie. So one of the first comments we had tonight was the question about like, what do you do during overtime? I'm like, well, I'm just going to do the same thing I do for the rest of the game. Well, coach, that sounds easy. Well, it is easy because we want a goalie, or we want any athlete, to be in a position where they understand what's going on in their body. So when I was a young athlete and I got the butterflies, I didn't know what the hell that meant. I remember being in like 8th grade playing for the the hockey team I played for was the Trojans, and everybody laughed at the name of that. It was kind of funny. We were all too young to really know what the hell that meant. But the idea is, I remember my coach McEachern, talked about like we made it to the final of this like junior division, and I was the goalie. And I remember in my room, like all day long, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was visualizing playing. I was visualizing making saves. I had my glove on. I loved wearing my hockey goalie glove, like at home. And what I didn't realize at the time was I was just getting myself in the game, in the headspace. And man, I remember going out on that, and this is a long time ago, but I still remember those feelings of going out there and feeling weak in my hands and not knowing what the hell that was. And what I'm going to teach you is, and what you need to teach your athlete is that those feelings that they have, those sensations that they have, are a biological response. Okay. And what drives me crazy is that when I hear, and I'm going to talk about this tonight on my other podcast, when I hear athletes talking about like being nervous or talking about the pressure or feeling that they're going to let people down, you don't do that. You don't talk about that stuff. You don't give a voice to those feelings. What you want to understand though is like, what are the feelings? What's going on? So for me, when I got tingly hands, and I got a little lightheaded, part of it was because I didn't feel good to eat during the day. Right. So then what ends up happening is like, okay, you've got this nervous energy coursing through your body and then you don't eat. Well, now your blood sugar's low. So when your blood sugar goes low, you're going to get a little lightheaded and that exacerbates the problem. And so what happens here, and I say this quite kind of defiantly, is like elite athletes don't have anxiety. Now, if you've got an eighth grader that barely cleans their room and can barely focus, it's hard to think of your athlete as elite. But the idea is like you take an elite approach to the game, just no matter what your level of play is. Okay, so you may not be an elite goalie yet, but you still take an elite attitude. And elite athletes don't have anxiety, but what they have is excitement. Okay, and there's a great study done at Harvard that basically prove that just the change of words changes a person's attitude. So that person who goes into a public speaking event, maybe you're pitching your boss on something, or you're trying to land a new contract and you're in sales or whatever, or you're asking for your boss for a raise. It's the same thing. You're going in there, your brain is basically ready for a fight. And then it floods your body full of endorphins and all sorts of other neurochemicals. It's not just endorphins, but the idea is that there's those chemicals that cause you to feel anxious and those that cause you to feel excited are the same. It's just how you define it. Right. So what I couldn't stand hearing at the Olympics so far is athletes talking about how nervous they were. And so what ends up happening, so David, to your point, is this idea that the twisties and all that stuff, you can like basically voodoo an athlete into those things, right? If you're going down that road and you're telling yourself, if your internal voice is like, oh my God, this is like, the biggest stage in the world, or it's overtime, or it's tryouts, like whatever it is, it can totally derail your goalie because the brain, as you're thinking about it, is starting to play like right there. But as I've said before, it's like your kids in math class, or they're riding in the car, or they're whatever. And now now their hands are tingly and they don't know what the hell that is. So it's like, oh my God, this is horrible. I can't compete. It's all too much. And that's where we're going with this conversation, by the way, is people are going like, oh my God, it's too much. Hillsgrove Boys Youth Lacrosse on Instagram writes, never mention the shanks. Exactly. You never talk about the yips. You don't talk about the shanks, right? You don't talk about the twisties, right? You talk about you talk about like the solution, right? And basically the bottom line is you have an overwhelming level of energy that you've never really dealt with before. And so it's really, really important. Mom writes, adrenaline rush. Dave and Ammerhouse writes, someone needs to ask TB12 about nerves when the score was 28-3. Hopefully he writes a book about how to stay cool and focused. Yeah, and David, to that point, when one athlete bows out because they had the twisties or whatever, they're anxious, they're nervous, another athlete managed that, right? So, and again, this is where people go like, oh, but she had like Black Lives Matter and she had the Larry Nassar case and she had all this and all this. Well, listen, pressure is something you load up on yourself. Okay. And what happens a lot of times is the people around an athlete will feed the moment. And one thing I'm going to talk about tonight is inputs. This idea of like your inputs matter, and that's like the thing. Everything you ingest, that includes the stuff that goes in your body, like what you eat and what you drink, but also the what goes into your head, right? Like if you're on social media, or if your coach says like, oh, yeah, once my drunk uncle, he was in the state final, and he got the yips and he couldn't putt straight, like whatever. Right. So you got to protect those things. But the biggest thing is to realize, and what I want everybody to understand, is that your athlete is not anxious, right? Anxiety is a negative term to the same neurochemical process that happens when you're excited. Okay. It's just all in how you want to view that. And like I said, sport is the harshest test, because there's, if your goalie backs out because they're nervous, well, there's some other goalie that's just going to step right in. Right. So we just want that to be your goalie. So part of this also is understanding personality. And in my mental performance school program, one of the things I put athletes through is a personality test. Now, personality tests, especially young athletes, are very fluid. They're also very fluid as you get older. Like we all know this as adults. We can go into certain situations and we can kind of morph into what we need to be to survive in that situation, right? And then we can go back to kind of who we are on the whole, right, as a general rule. So that's really important to understand. And the message that came out this week about like, oh, if you're not feeling great, you should back off, that came off well before the conversation about the twisties. And I wrote a big like 16-page article on my blog at athletespecific.com about Simone Biles. If you guys want to check that out and learn more about that, go check that out. It's the latest one is up at Athlete Specific. It's also in my LinkedIn feed. But the idea that is that anxiety is not something that your athlete really needs to deal with. It's all in how they approach it. So Carrie Ann writes, Dr. Jared Spencer talks about this and how we need to get athletes to understand that anxiety isn't all bad. Excitement is a good thing. It totally is. It actually helps you compete. And yeah, Dr. Jared Spencer stole my idea. Just kidding. Whatever. Mind over matter. Yes. And although I'm not with the mind over matter comment, I'm not one to say like, sports is 100% mental. It's not. There's an athletic component. There's a physical ability component. There's a technical ability component. There's a tactical ability component wrapped in the first layer, okay, which is resources, time, energy, and money to develop those abilities, which is wrapped by life skills, right? Because if your goalie is just a complete doofus, that's going to be the default out. And then finally, it's belief, right? Belief in all those things. So, but I'm not one to say like, oh, it's 100%. It's 100% mental all the time. That's not true. Even when people try to quantify like, oh, it's the last 10%. Nah, it's whatever. So Patrick Francis writes, attitude makes a difference. Attitude's good, but you can have a really good attitude and jump out of a plane without a parachute, right? Be like, yay, my attitude's great. And go splat, right? So attitude can make a difference. But what I want my athlete to understand is what's going on physically, physiologically, so that in relation to what it is they're thinking about and why. And parents can do a lot to either feed that negatively, or because a lot of times parents are trying to be an elite athlete alongside their athlete who's trying to be really good at something, but the parent doesn't have any skill in that either. Right. So it's like the blind leading the blind in that moment. And so sometimes good natured parents that don't want their kids to be disappointed can say stuff that just kind of falls apart. Okay. All right. Patrick, thanks for that comment. All right, guys. Thanks for watching and thanks for listening wherever you are. Do me a favor, hit the like button if you like this, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. When you're ready, head on over to lacrossegoalieuniversity.com/coaching so I can work with you and your goalie. And while you're at it, check out athletespecific.com to learn more about mental performance and high performance. You may not know this, but I work with athletes in a variety of sports. Lacrosse is my love, but man, I love athletes and the families who support them. So head on over to athletespecific.com, check it out. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.